So when it comes to articulation, the good news is it's not super complicated on the bassoon, but it is really important that students start tonguing right away. So if they're just getting started on the bassoon, they probably are playing on the reed and vocal a little bit to just practice their basic embouchure and air, and that's the right time to start them on tonguing. So basically just trying it on here and telling them to use the tip of the tongue to touch the tip of the reed. And just listen and see if that creates kind of a reasonable articulation. The temptation is to over-explain tonguing. And on the bassoon, especially because the tongue is essentially just releasing that airflow, it's important to just try to let the student naturally get in the habit of that exhale and then say, oh, by the way, touch the tip of the reed with the tip of the tongue. And there are a few other things we can do, which I'll talk about now. But just give it a try first. My air is constant. It's just one deflation of my big balloon of air. And I'm just touching the reed with the tip of my tongue. And that's pretty much getting me the basics. Now, the things you should know is that the tongue is not moving toward the reed, or at least we don't want to think about, I'm going to attack a note with my tongue moving toward the reed, but rather that the tongue is coming away. So the way you can work on that is with some other woodwinds. This works too. Just put your tongue on the reed, take the breath, and then as the air is exhaled, have the student pull their tongue back to release the sound into the instrument. So that can get them in the practice of getting their tongue moving backward, which is really the right direction, especially once tonguing becomes really rapid. If they're trying to poke the tongue forward a bunch of times in a row, they probably won't get a lot of tonguing agility. So there's not a whole lot of the tongue actually touching the reed. If they're getting a huge slab of the tongue on there, you're probably going to hear it. So listen for big interruptions to the tone. And it's sort of the flat front of the tongue, maybe not the very, very tip. They will feel a little bit of a tickle as they're doing it for the first few times, and that's okay. But just encourage them to use sort of the flat front of the tongue, and that's the appropriate place for them to touch. They can also practice between their lips to really work on releasing that air. Because the tongue is coming pretty central to touch the reed, it's not unheard of or bad to practice just by sticking the tongue out here. So the benefit there is I'm letting a ton of air out, and so I'm going to have to take a really big breath in order to get a few of those tongues. And lo and behold, we're trying to get students to use a whole lot of air when they're playing their bassoon. So just tonguing between the lips is a reasonable exercise. So jaw movement is sometimes the stereotypical bassoon player sometimes. Kind of hard to hear on here, but when they're playing their low notes, you kind of see that jaw or chewing motion, especially if they're playing staccatos. And that has something to do with being open enough to play low notes. And it also sometimes has something to do with a compensation for pitch. But jaw motion is okay. It just shouldn't be all the time. And it's usually in certain scenarios, especially when playing low notes. If there is jaw motion, you definitely want to make sure that jaw motion is just up and down, that it's not lateral, like teeth grinding side to side. If the jaw is moving, it should be open and shut, up and down. So on a low note, like low F, for instance, my jaw might move down a little bit as I tongue to make sure that it's responding and I'm not pinching it sharp. For how low my jaw is, my tongue, as soon as it gets moving, sometimes it draws the jaw up just a little bit and then it goes back to do or even daw for the low pitch. So it's really just the mouth opening up to the appropriate voicing. So have your students from, C natural, second space C, and down is do, and then down beyond, E and maybe lower, they can start to think da. And da, you can see right there, super low jaw motion. It's going to be very open. So in order to tongue on a low E, I'll try a low D. In order to tongue on a real low note, they're going to have to open that jaw just a little bit. So, jaw motion is okay, and if they're trying to do it fast, there might be a little bit more. So just keep in mind there are some situations where that motion is okay, but if they're doing it a lot up high, there's a pretty good chance that they've started pinching or that they're actually not attacking with enough air right off the bat, and what they've learned to do is pinch the reed just a little bit at that moment. This has to do a little bit with dynamics as well. So when we play dynamics, if you start playing softer, we reduce the amount of air, and according to the air-embouchure balance, that's going to make the pitch go down. So sometimes at a lower dynamic level, if we don't have an alternate fingering that can bring that pitch up for us, and there are some alternate fingerings designed to help the bassoon play in tune when playing really soft, but if we don't have an alternate fingering, then sometimes the lip pressure does increase a little bit to help the pitch stay up and stay where it needs to be. At the same time, when you play really loud on forte, the jaw tends to open a little bit more and give that reed not only more space to vibrate, but actually lower the lip pressure and help compensate for the increased air, which is going to raise the pitch. Relaxing the lip pressure helps compensate and get it in tune so it doesn't go sharp at a really loud dynamic level. So jaw motion at a large dynamic level might also create a little bit, you might also see a little bit of jaw motion at a loud dynamic level. So to continue with tonguing, get them started trying to tongue with some agility before too long, because by the time they need it, you want to make sure they've been practicing tonguing. And they'll probably do this in regular band with the exercises you do with your other students. But if you're teaching them alone or getting them set up to practice for the summer or something like that, give them a simple tonguing exercise, something like 8th note, 2/16 notes at roughly quarter note equals 60. So keeping that airflow really, really steady is a challenge, but get them started and then start to assess things like right now my tongue's a little heavy. I'm spending a little bit too much time on the reed, and I need to work on getting my air a little more continuous and to help my tone be nice and full while I'm articulating. So after you've taught that exercise, you can start to ratchet up the metronome and develop a little bit of tonguing facility. Finally, back related a little bit to dynamics, but also just attacking and releasing notes. The trick on a release, I talked about how on an attack, sometimes they don't use enough air and they compensate by pinching with the lips. Well, the same thing will happen sometimes if the bassoonist is always releasing notes with just air. So if you imagine the air kind of decreasing right at the end of a note, it does what many woodwinds do at the end of a note and starts to dip flat. So the solution in a lot of ways is, if the style allows for it, just release the note by putting the tongue back onto the reed. And that stops the reed from vibrating at a strong airstream level and prevents that dip at the end of the note. So with no tongue stop and just letting the air go, I get something like this. And I've been doing this a lot in the videos you've been watching. Now, the way that you can prevent that is just putting the tongue on that tip of the reed to release the note. So this is where teaching them to release the tone into the instrument by pulling back the tongue is super useful, because now they've stopped the tongue by putting the tongue onto the reed, and they're going to start their sound again by pulling it away. And that can also be trained to get a little faster on a basic rhythm starting with a slow metronome marking. So that's some of the details you should know about articulation. Read a little bit more information below, and make sure you spend some time practicing your tonguing on bassoon.